Support for Illinois Lawmakers comes from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Information available at paulsimoninstitute.org.
Welcome back to Illinois Lawmakers' continuing coverage of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. I'm Jak Tichenor, along with Bernard Schoenburg, the veteran political columnist for the State Journal-Register in Springfield. Good to have you back on the show.
Nice to be with you, Jak.
Bernie, the last couple of days here at the Capitol have been fascinating. The Senate has, as it has been for the last few weeks and actually months, been the focal point of the activity here. There might have been some votes on the grand bargain this week, but fell short of passage.
Well, there was one.
And
it was a minor bill. It had to do with, I think, local governments and how they deal with debt. Everybody could agree on it. They passed it in grand bargain version, which would go along with the other more than 10 bills, and they also passed it individually. But then when they got to the more serious things, like a property tax freeze and some changes in workers' compensation, President Cullerton, who decided this was the day to finally get back at this, said to Leader Radonio, "These are your bills," the Republican leader in the Senate, and she said, "We're not ready, the package isn't ready, we're close, but I'm not going to call those bills today." So, we're almost, as you say, back to ground zero, but Leader Radonio was more optimistic and said, "We're working on this, we're close." But in a press conference afterwards, President Cullerton basically said, Democrats in the Senate are trying to get this over to the House so that they can deal with it. We have compromised as much as we can. And he said something like, the governor's people have never passed a bill and don't know how to govern, which, again, that's
harsh words.
Harsh words. Well, of course, the governor has been providing lots of harsh words to Democrats along the way, particularly Speaker Madigan. So.
And at this point, what we're basically talking about is a different version of the grand bargain that Senate Republican Deputy Leader Bill Brady from Bloomington is working on, a 5-year income tax increase and an expansion of the service tax as long as it's coupled with a 5-year property tax freeze.
Right, and what we know from what Senator Cullerton said yesterday, the Democrats are putting forth a 2-year property tax freeze because if you have such limited funding from the state, and of course even going up to a near 5% income tax, you've got a $12 billion backlog. You've got local governments and school districts and certainly their universities in their towns have been struggling without getting money. So you're not going to have a tremendous amount of money. So President Cullerton's view is we can't squeeze local governments more than to say a 2-year property tax freeze because it's so important to the governor. But from the governor's side of things, as told, I believe, by Senator Radonio, 5 years is a must, even though the governor has talked about a permanent property tax freeze. So they could only be raised at the local level with a vote, and we know how hard that can be. So your school districts, your local governments getting less from the state, even if something happens with the budget, but then not being able to raise taxes locally for, police, fire, they would say, essential services and other things. Difficult time.
Still a long way to go between now and May 31st. A lot could happen between now and then.
We are always hopeful in Springfield, but the way the last 2 years have gone, it's a tough one.
Bernie Schoenburg, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it as always. We're focusing on education on this edition of Illinois Lawmakers. Up next on the program, we'll look at K-12 school funding reform. Illinois lawmakers have been looking at ways to change how the state pays for elementary and secondary education since the 1950s, but they may finally be closing in on a plan to have a chance at succeeding. Joining us on the program are Assistant Senate Republican Leader Jason Barickman of Bloomington and House Elementary and Secondary Education Appropriations Chairman Will Davis, Democrat from Homewood. Good to have you both on the program.
Thank you, Chef.
Senator Barickman, Representative Davis, you've both been your respective caucuses point people on this piece of this point of contention for some time now. Define the problem. A lot of it comes down to the fact that the state of Illinois relies heavily on the property tax to fund K through 12 schools.
I think you've illustrated it perfectly. There's a constitutional provision that says that the state is supposed to provide most of the funding, at least half, if you will, of K through 12 education, and we have not done that for a number of years. I'm told it's about 26%, somewhere in that neighborhood. So this will be an effort to not only shift that burden and make sure that the state lives up to its end of the bargain, but also provide a completely new way of going about how we administer and distribute those funds as well.
And Senator, part of the problem as a result of this, by relying so heavily on the property taxes, you have a situation where you have basically inequities built into the whole system. You have rich districts that can do very well by their students and poor districts who can't do well at all.
Yeah, the common criticism is that your zip code shouldn't determine the quality of your education. And the reality in Illinois is that we have vastly different educational opportunities that exist solely dependent on one zip code. So I think we're trying to fix the way or change the way the state of Illinois distributes the money so that we're distributing the limited resources that we have to the school districts who are most in need.
You were both part of the governor's bipartisan commission on school funding reform. Literally dozens of hours and hearings and probably hundreds more behind the scenes and phone calls and conversations over the past year or so. What did you arrive at a roadmap for actually fixing this thing at long last?
Well, I think at the very least, I think we all came to the conclusion that it does need to be fixed. What we talked most about was what is called the evidence-based model, which suggests that based on where a school is, we will provide resources to help them bring in whatever is necessary to better educate children, not only improving in the classroom, but also looking at social service work, social counselors, additional teacher aides, whatever that district needs in order to better educate children. It was a pathway toward trying to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. You know, definitely the buy-in that this is a statewide problem that needs to be fixed is a significant accomplishment of the commission. I think, you know, if you look at where we were on this issue 2 years ago compared to where we are today, you have buy-in from the governor, from all four caucuses, both chambers. That's significant. You also think of where we were 2 years ago. There were lots of ideas on how we might approach this. And today I think you sense a coalescing around this evidence-based model that really relies on data and best practices to determine funding decisions. This is something that's been done in other states, but it's a relatively new concept, but it's one that's got a lot of legs here, I think, in the Illinois legislature.
Absolutely.
And part of the way this works are like something like 27 different factors. Part of them you just listed, Representative Davis, and the idea is to work on those factors to determine how much state funding a district actually gets. What are some of those criteria? You know, some of those are students living in poverty, English language skills.
Well, I mean, the three big ones, if you will, are the same three big ones we've always dealt with. Again, you mentioned English learners, poverty, students living in poverty, and also special education. Those are the three big drivers, and we're kind of building around those three issues.
Yeah, I mean, throw a few others in the mix. I think some things that, you know, Will certainly talks to things that are important to a lot of families around the state. Class size is another one of those factors. Definitely, you talk to any parent, and one of the first questions they ask when they move to a new school district is, what size class is my student going to be in? So class size, technology, the availability of resources for gifted students or students of special needs, all are part of those 27 data elements.
So you arrive at a target, and the idea behind this target number is how far away you are from that. And
at a district level.
Right, at the district level, individual district level.
And that's really the fundamental change here from current law. Currently, we apply kind of a blanket across the state. We call it a foundation level that applies to every school district. This would say, let's take a unique look, a snapshot at every individual district, and based on their unique demographics and needs, we create a adequacy
target.
Yeah.
And that meeting that adequacy target is where the new state dollars go into the individual districts, correct?
Yes. Again, determining an adequacy target, but taking into consideration that district's local available wealth, what they can contribute to that. And ultimately, we determine that adequacy target, and the idea is to build, or should I say the idea is to take the districts furthest away from their adequacy targets and try to target the dollars to them first so they can catch up for lack of a better way of putting it.
One of the toughest parts of this to deal with, Republican criticism of the school funding reform issue over the years has been that it's been a classic redistribution of wealth. Wealthier school districts wouldn't see as much money, while the poorer districts would get more from the state. How did you get past that?
Well,
in this model?
So I think what you see here is some buy-in from districts around the state who say, we recognize that we have more resources available locally than other districts, and that to be a quality state, we need to have a quality educational system. One of the things that we've introduced in the legislation I've proposed is mandate relief, which really is a nudge toward an effort to say to those districts who have more resources locally that even though you're not going to get more out of a funding change, we're going to give you more flexibility and resources to make your own decisions locally and hopefully drive down your costs and hopefully drive down your property taxes.
Another way that we've gotten that buy-in is that we walk into this what we call a real hold harmless. So we recognize that shifting dollars from some district to others is always a challenge and usually is a non-starter. So if we at least start from the premise that every district will receive the same dollars that they've received before, then there's a hold harmless, and that's also created some of the buy-in as well.
Yeah, another person who's been working on this with you all over the past few years is Senator Andy Bernard, Democrat from Bunker Hill. How does the versions you're talking about differ from what he's put on the table on the Senate Democrat side?
Well, you want to go ahead?
Well, I think it's his most recent version mirrors kind of what we're doing in the House, and I think Jason and I recognize that there are some differences in what we're attempting to do, but still recognizing he talked about mandate relief. We know we've got to try to figure something out with mandate relief, so it's just a matter of how we all wind up in the same spot.
Here's a $3.5 billion question, though. The additional state money needed to get all these districts to be at or above their adequacy target is expected to be a minimum of $3.5 billion over the next 10 years. And if the state's actually going to pay the majority of school funding, like the Constitution says, that's another $2.5 billion. Looking at the state's financial situation right now, how are we going to even get close to that?
Well, I would say that at least in the past years, even though we've had some ups and downs with the overall budget, we still have come together on education funding. And I'm not suggesting that this year's situation will only focus on education. We're really trying to take a broad approach to the budget, but we know that that's just one of the biggest hurdles that we have to. But it's the one hurdle that all of us, I think, as representatives and senators talk about when we are going through our election process, how we want to help improve education. So truly, if that's what we want to do, here's a great opportunity to do it.
I think, if you look at just the last 3 years in Illinois, over the last 3 years, Illinois has made significant investments. Somewhere around $1 billion more is being invested in our schools today than it was 3 years ago. So there is this mindset, and I think it's bipartisan, that a further investment needs to be made in our schools. We just need to make sure that as that investment's made, we're getting it to those schools who are most in need. The hope is that we can lift those schools up and provide those school children a better opportunity.
The outcomes are a very important part of this discussion on both sides of the aisle in both chambers.
We've got about a minute left. How will Chicago schools fare under this plan?
Well, under my plan, Chicago schools do better than they've done in the past. We still have some issues with Chicago, particularly as it relates to pension costs, that they would like to see dealt with from previous years. So we're trying to figure that out. But I think just minimally, Chicago will do better in my bill than they've done in previous bills.
Yeah, I think this is one of the decisions I think the legislature is going to have to make. How we treat Chicago. There's a very controversial Chicago block grant. Right. We've heard that Chicago wants the state of Illinois to pick up its pension costs like we do for other school districts. So I think these are some key decisions that the legislature will need to make. I think, Representative Davis and I have tried to highlight, here's some of the choices that we'll need to make. He's got his approach, I've got mine. In the end, I think we're going to have to come together if we're going to get over the hurdle on this and some of those key choices.
Considering the amount of ground that's been covered over the last 3 years, can you do this in the next 3 weeks?
Absolutely.
Sure. Absolutely.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time on Illinois Lawmakers. We certainly appreciate it. The state's nearly 2-year-old budget impasse is hitting home and university cities around the state, where schools have cut hundreds of jobs and slashed dozens of programs. That topic is next on Illinois Lawmakers. The Illinois House Committee on Economic Opportunity has been holding hearings on the budget impact, the budget impasse's impact on state universities. We're joined by the Democratic Committee Chairman, Representative Christian Mitchell of Chicago, and Republican spokesman Mike Fortner of West Chicago. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on Illinois Lawmakers. First of all, the House Committee on Economic Opportunity is a relatively new committee here at the state capitol. What's its charge? What do you look into as a rule?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having me on the program. And I actually started the Economic Opportunity Committee. I actually named it after Lyndon Johnson's office during the War on Poverty, because I wanted a committee that was going to focus on what were sort of the hard, what does the hard data say about what we need to do to bring economic opportunity back to the state of Illinois. And the first thing that I started looking at when looking at sort of Moody's Analytics reports and other things is higher education has an enormous economic impact, not just on individual lives, but on regions like the south side of Chicago or Charleston or Macomb or Carbondale. And so wanted the committee to start looking into that so that we could really see what is the impact of this budget impasse, but more importantly, what is our vision for higher education and the economy in Illinois?
And I think that's an important consideration, because not only does higher education provide economic opportunities for those individuals who are able to get a degree, which will get them typically better job prospects with those degrees, but also for the state overall. There's a lot of data that suggests where you go to university, where you go to college, is a strong factor in where you will choose to settle. So by having strong university, strong college system, we help our future by having people able to grow here in Illinois.
Well, I've seen that over the years. Most of my career was spent at SIU Carbondale, and you'd see a lot of folks from Chicago area and out of state move to the southern end of the state, just like they would go to Northern or Charleston or Macomb or Bloomington Normal, and they'd stay there because they liked the community and they brought a lot to the life of the community.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, because when you're in college, it's for a lot of students, the first time you're really away from your family and you get a chance to be yourself, interacting with the community around you, not just in the context of your own family. And I think that's what helps draw people to the towns or the states where they did go to school.
And the thing that's really interesting about that, and we heard this in our hearing at SIU Carbondale, is effectively SIU Carbondale is the mill for that town. And it's true of the university sort of across the state. As we heard from local business owners and of course the university president, as the university goes, so goes that town. And so one of the things we wanted to highlight is, regardless of, so we've got, the turnaround agenda, this budget impasse, all these things, but there is no more important thing to turn around the state of Illinois than a really deep and abiding investment in higher education, and the data bears that out.
And let's talk about that investment. The Civic Federation Budget Watchdog says higher education has received average annual funding over the last 2 years of around 41.8% of the level of fiscal year 2015, the last year we actually had a full state budget. The funding shortfall based on that FY 2015 annual amount is $1.7 billion statewide. So how's that impact translating to the economies in towns like Carbondale and DeKalb?
Well, it's horrendous, and you see this reflected in, so Moody's Analytics does a report for this, for COGFA, which is our forecasting arm here at the state of Illinois every single year, and what they say is the number one thing driving job growth downstate, especially south of I-80, in Chicago, but especially south of I-80, really is our public universities. So when you cut them by 60%, which is a number we would have, by the way, arrived at anyway based on the governor's budget numbers over the past couple of years, you've devastated those communities, and you're losing high quality faculty. You are losing sort of the third tier of services potentially that places like SIU do in terms of broadcasting, in terms of their fermentation center. So those things are starting to atrophy on the vine, and it's been a very devastating impact. And so my hope is that our next budget process will show a deep and abiding commitment to higher education.
I think that's important, because even before the impasse of the last couple of years, we were seeing university funding that was not increasing at the rate of inflation even, that it was relatively stagnant, because one of the problems we've had is in part probably because of our commitment to higher education. We've seen the population of Illinois decline the last 3 years. That puts a lot of pressure on all parts of the budget. Maybe it's the last 4 years where we're going to wait and see when the new data comes out next year. But that pressure has caused us to be pretty much flat in our university appropriations, and that means that they have to make hard choices even before the cuts that we've seen in the last couple of years.
And you end up in a situation, as I hear from a lot of my faculty colleagues, you're in a situation where it's hard to keep quality faculty in a state where you don't know what the higher education budget is going to be. You have other states that are poaching faculty and staff, and they're doing pretty well at our expense.
Oh, it's a little bit like the Hunger Games, honestly. You've got a situation where you have, so what I've been told by university faculty is they've established a fund, for example, in Texas, to actually come and poach faculty from universities in Illinois, because we have so underperformed on higher education. People are saying, this isn't a place that I want to continue my career, and that is problematic. And what I think is deeply important is that, again, our next sort of budget from our governor, the next budget that we sort of pass out of the House, has a deep commitment to higher education, because the matter of the fact is it's seen a 60% cut over 3 years. And if you add together the governor's first budget proposal at 30%, the next one at 20%, the next at 15%, you basically arrive at where we are. And so we need a commitment to higher education if indeed we really care about people south of I-80.
So you've held a hearing in Carbondale. Ostensibly you will be holding more around the state in coming weeks and months. What are you going to do with the data you gather?
So my goal is to, one of the things that I love about Representative Fortner and like working with him is because he's a numbers guy. And I went to University of Chicago, I'm a numbers guy too. And so what we want is the raw data on the impact of higher education. And I want to contrast it directly to some of the other things that have been alleged, whether it's by Republicans or Democrats, to really be economic drivers for the state of Illinois, because I believe higher education wins out. I think it's incredibly important to my community on the south side. It's incredibly important downstate. It's incredibly important to individual students. One of the reasons why we went to SIU first is because SIU is an incredibly important access institution for my constituents. You take students who might not be quite as prepared as they should be coming out of Chicago public schools, and SIU generally gets them through in 6 years. Those are kids who are not going to turn to a life of crime, who are going to be examples and role models in their community. This is an incredibly important investment for the state of Illinois, and I want the data and the testimony to show it.
And I think that's one of the things, when you say an investment, that makes it hard when we are looking at how do we commit to higher education, because it is an investment. Many of the returns are years down the line. If a student is going to be there 6 years, you may not see that investment return until then. And then how they perform as a productive member of society in the workforce, that's even longer. And that makes it harder than many other aspects of what we do budgetarily, where often there's an immediate impact to where those dollars go.
I think it's exactly right, and this is one of the challenges, I think, is that some of our colleagues, or even some folks in the governor's office, seem to look at the university system and say there's so much waste, there's so much fraud, there's so much corruption, and the data doesn't really necessarily bear that out. What you have is you have more counselors, you have more people who are giving strong academic supports, because our K-12 system, which we've underfunded for years, is not turning out the raw product that our universities need, and so they need a little bit more help. We've got students who are still able to make it but need a bit more support, and so the idea that academic support for students is administrative bloat or is waste or is fraud or is corruption, I think is inaccurate. And I think that when you look at the overhead of our universities relative to our surrounding states and the rest of the nation, it's pretty low. And so the question is there a real commitment from the administration to say higher education is something that ought to be accessible to every child in Illinois, or should it just be for those who afford it? That's the critical question we have to answer. It has real regional impacts around the state.
And as we look at this, we're roughly 3 weeks before the scheduled end of the session on May 31st. The House passed out a few weeks back a stopgap or lifeline bill for higher education that would spend, there's about $559 million for higher education. Half of that would be earmarked for tuition support through the Monetary Award Program. There's another $258 million in that lifeline bill for social service agencies around the state. Ideally, though, you would like to have a full year's budget.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You want to have a full year's budget, because going back to what you were suggesting with and what was being said about the loss to faculty, the loss of predictability for parents. Do they want to send their students if they don't know what kind of resources the university will bring? You need that predictability of a full year budget, of building it all into a single package so that there is predictability, that people know that come fall of 2017, there's going to be a full academic year of support for the programs at the university.
Yeah, and look, we would all love a full budget. I think we're all working toward that. And obviously, if myself and Representative Fortner were the only two people negotiating on it, we'd probably have it done in 35 minutes. But in the meantime, while the university system is starving, while you've got social service agencies or child care agencies or places that care for the sick or the infirm literally dying on the vine, we've got money sitting in accounts that cannot be spent for any other purpose. Let's get some of that out to make sure that we've still got some universities and social service agencies left when this impasse is over.
And to explain that, that's basically the money we're talking about in that Lifeline bill is basically being collected as a fraction of
a certain percentage of the income tax comes in, it goes directly into these funds for the Commitment to Human Services, Commitment to Higher Education funds. That money is going to be sitting there, so why not use it, try to paper over some of the universities and social service agencies that are hurting.
What I'd say is, and a year ago, last April, one of the things that happened is we identified that fund, the higher education component of that, and we said, a number of us, both Republicans and Democrats, got together and we said, let's figure out how to get that money effectively, and we were able to do that in a space of less than 2 weeks, go from discussions to a signed bill. So we can get that done.
Gentlemen, thanks very much. Good luck on your work. We certainly appreciate your time on Illinois Lawmakers. That is it for this week's edition of Illinois Lawmakers. We'll be back next week at the same time as we continue our weekly coverage of the last scheduled month of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. From all of us at Illinois Lawmakers, so long from Springfield.